The moment I placed my engagement ring on the table, the room went silent. 37 people were sitting around that long dinner table. My mother was there. My husband's best friend was there. My father's business partners were there. Everyone had come to celebrate our engagement. And yet, somehow, the loudest sound in the room had been my husband's laugh. Not a nervous laugh. Not the kind of laugh someone gives when they don't know what else to say. A real laugh. The kind that makes you realize the person sitting beside you may not understand how deeply you've just been hurt. Because only seconds earlier, my father had stood up, raised his glass, looked directly at me, and told everyone that I had married into a family that could give me everything I had ever wanted. Then he looked at my husband and called him a gold digger. I waited for my husband to defend me. He didn't. He laughed. That was the moment everything I thought I knew about my marriage began to fall apart. My name is Claire Morgan. I'm 34 years old. And until that night, I honestly believed I had finally learned how to build a life that belonged to me. I had a career I was proud of. I had my own apartment before I married. I had spent years becoming financially independent because my father had always made sure I understood exactly how much our family name was worth. My father, Richard Morgan, was a successful real estate developer. He had built his business over 4 decades. And with that success came a certain kind of confidence. He believed money gave him the right to ask difficult questions. He believed family gave him the right to interfere. And unfortunately, I had spent most of my life believing that keeping him happy was the same thing as keeping the peace. Then I met Daniel. I met him at a technology conference in Nashville almost 3 years ago. He wasn't the kind of man who entered a room expecting attention. He was quiet, observant, slightly awkward in large groups. But when he spoke about his work, everything changed. Daniel had built a small software company from nothing. He had started with a laptop, a credit card, and an idea nobody else thought would work. By the time I met him, his company was profitable. He wasn't rich by my family standards, but he was proud of what he had built. And more importantly, he had never once asked me what my father owned. That was one of the first things I loved about him. Our first conversation lasted almost 2 hours. We talked about work, childhood, terrible camping experiences, books, restaurants, and all the little things people normally don't discuss until much later. When he finally asked me to have coffee with him, I said yes. I didn't know it then, but that coffee would become the beginning of the most beautiful and painful chapter of my life. Daniel never tried to impress me. He didn't care about my father's company. He didn't ask about our family property. He never asked what kind of car I drove or where I grew up. He simply wanted to know me. For the first time in years, I felt like someone was looking at Claire instead of looking at the Morgan name. We dated for almost 8 months before I introduced him to my parents. I was nervous, not because I was unsure about Daniel. I was nervous because I knew my father. My parents lived in a beautiful old house outside Knoxville. It sat behind a large gate surrounded by trees, with a long circular driveway that made the property look more like a private estate than a family home. My father greeted Daniel with a smile. Then he spent the next 2 hours questioning him. What do you do? How much does your company make? Do you own it? Do you have investors? What are your plans for expansion? Daniel answered every question calmly. He didn't brag. He didn't become defensive. He simply told the truth. My father listened carefully. After dinner, he pulled me aside. He's ambitious, Dad said. I smiled. I know. He understands what your family has. I remember frowning. He hasn't asked about any of that. My father shrugged. Men don't always ask directly. I ignored him. I wanted to believe he was simply being protective. For the next year and a half, Daniel and I built our life together. We bought a house outside Nashville. We cooked together. We argued about stupid things. We traveled. We planned our future. And eventually Daniel proposed. He did it on a rooftop overlooking Nashville on the same night we'd celebrated our first anniversary. I remember staring at the ring and crying. Not because it was expensive. It wasn't. I cried because Daniel had chosen it carefully. He knew I hated flashy jewelry. He knew I liked simple things. He had apparently spent weeks talking to a jeweler about what would suit me. When he finally put the ring on my finger, I said yes before he even finished asking. We called my parents. My mother cried. My father said congratulations. For once, I thought maybe everything was going to be okay. 3 weeks later, we held our engagement dinner. 37 people came. Friends, family, co-workers, people who had watched us fall in love. The restaurant was beautiful. Warm lighting, white tablecloths, soft music. Everything felt perfect. Until my father stood up. He began with a beautiful speech about me. He talked about how determined I had always been, how I had worked hard, how he was proud of the woman I had become. Then he turned toward Daniel. His smile changed. "And Daniel," he said, "I want to say something about you too." Daniel smiled. My stomach tightened. My father continued. "When Claire first brought you home, I did what any responsible father would do. I looked into your background." The room became quieter. "You've built a nice little company," he said. Daniel nodded. Then Dad said something that made my entire body go cold. "My daughter has a family trust. She has security. She has a future that was guaranteed long before she met you." Nobody moved. My father looked directly at Daniel. Men who come from less sometimes see opportunity when they see prosperity. I could hear my own heartbeat. Then he said it. "I hope you're marrying my daughter for the right reasons." Someone at the table shifted uncomfortably. My mother put down her glass. Daniel looked at me, and then he laughed. A small laugh at first. Then he looked away and laughed again. I stared at him. I couldn't understand what I was seeing. My father had just humiliated him in front of everyone, and Daniel was laughing. I whispered his name. "Daniel!" He looked at me, but instead of defending me, he smiled. My father sat down. A few people tried to continue the dinner, but the atmosphere had changed. I looked at Daniel again. He leaned toward me and whispered, "Your dad really thinks I'm after your money?" I nodded slowly. He laughed again. That was when something inside me broke, because it wasn't just my father's accusation anymore. It was the fact that my husband didn't seem to understand why it mattered. I looked down at my hand. The engagement ring suddenly felt heavier than it had 5 minutes earlier. I removed it. Daniel's smile disappeared. "What are you doing?" I placed the ring on the white tablecloth. Nobody spoke. My father watched me. My mother looked terrified. I stood. I didn't scream. I didn't insult anyone. I didn't explain myself. I simply picked up my purse. Then I looked at Daniel. "I thought you would know better." And I walked out. The cold air outside hit my face. I stood on the sidewalk for several minutes. Part of me wanted Daniel to run after me. He didn't. My phone started vibrating. Message after message. "Claire, where are you? Please come back." I was joking. "Your dad crossed a line." I didn't mean it like that. I didn't answer, because I didn't know what hurt more. My father's words, or my husband's reaction to them. I drove home alone. That night, I sat at the kitchen table until nearly midnight. When Daniel finally came home, he looked exhausted. He sat across from me. "Claire, I'm sorry." I looked at him. "What are you sorry for?" He hesitated. "For laughing." "Why did you laugh?" He rubbed his face. "Because I couldn't believe your father actually said it." "That isn't an answer." He looked down. I was embarrassed. "So you laughed." I didn't know what else to do. I stared at him. Then I asked the question that had been burning inside me since dinner. "Did you know my father thought that about you?" Daniel was silent. That silence told me everything. "You knew." I knew he had concerns. "How long?" "Several months." I felt my chest tighten. "And you never told me?" "I thought I could handle it." I almost laughed. "You thought you could handle my father deciding my husband was a gold digger?" "No. I thought eventually he'd see that he was wrong." I looked at the ring sitting on the table between us. "Daniel, you weren't supposed to handle him." He looked at me. "You were supposed to stand beside me." He didn't have an answer. The next week was painful. We lived in the same house, but it felt like we were strangers. We ate separately. We slept in different rooms. We spoke only when necessary. Then my father called Daniel. I didn't know about the call until later. Dad apologized, but not really. He apologized for the timing, for the setting, for embarrassing Daniel publicly. He never apologized for believing what he had said. Daniel asked him directly, "Do you actually believe I'm with Claire for her money?" My father paused. Then he said, "I believe people have complicated motivations." That answer told Daniel everything. When Daniel told me about the conversation, I finally understood something. My father wasn't the only problem. I was, because I had spent years managing my father's moods. When he was angry, I softened my words. When he criticized someone I loved, I defended him privately but stayed silent publicly. When he crossed a boundary, I convinced myself he was simply being protective. I had spent so long keeping peace that I had forgotten what peace actually meant. It didn't mean everyone was comfortable. Sometimes peace meant telling someone they had gone too far. I realized that I had expected Daniel to survive my father's behavior because I had been surviving it my entire life. That wasn't fair. So I made a decision. I called my father, and for the first time in my life, I told him something he didn't want to hear. "Dad, if you want to be part of my marriage, you have to respect my husband." He laughed. "You're serious?" "Yes." "You're choosing him over your family?" "No," I said. "I'm choosing my own life." There was silence. Then he said, "You'll regret this." Maybe I would. But for once, I wasn't afraid of regret. I was more afraid of becoming the kind of person who kept sacrificing herself just to keep someone else comfortable. I went back to Daniel that night. He was sitting at the same kitchen table where we'd had so many conversations. I sat across from him. "I don't know what happens next," I said. He nodded. "Neither do I. But I know I don't want my father deciding what our marriage looks like." Daniel looked at me. "And I don't want you to spend your life fighting him." "I won't," I said. "Then what changes?" I took a breath. "I do." That was the beginning of rebuilding our marriage. Not because everything magically became perfect. It didn't. Trust doesn't return because someone says sorry. It comes back through hundreds of small actions. Daniel learned to speak when something hurt him instead of hiding behind laughter. I learned to stop protecting my father from the consequences of his behavior. We both learned that love wasn't about avoiding conflict. It was about choosing each other when conflict came. Months later, my father came to our house. He sat at the same table. He looked at Daniel. Then he looked at me. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Finally, my father said, "I was wrong." Not about everything. Not dramatically. Not with tears or some perfect speech. Just 3 words. "I was wrong." Daniel nodded. "I appreciate you saying that." My father looked at me. I was afraid of losing my daughter. I swallowed. "You almost did." He looked down. "I know." That conversation didn't erase the engagement dinner. It didn't erase the humiliation. It didn't erase the months of tension. But it was a beginning. And eventually the ring came back. Not because I forgot what happened. Not because I decided my father had been right. And not because Daniel suddenly became perfect. The ring came back because we had both changed. I had learned to choose my marriage openly. Daniel had learned to trust that I would stand beside him. And my father had finally learned that loving his daughter did not mean controlling her life. We are still together. And when I think about that engagement dinner now, I don't remember the food. I don't remember the speeches. I don't even remember exactly what my father said. I remember the ring hitting the table. I remember the silence. And I remember walking away. For a long time, I thought walking away meant I had failed. Now, I understand something different. Sometimes walking away isn't the end. Sometimes it's the moment you finally tell everyone, including yourself, that your dignity is not negotiable. I still wear that ring. But now, every time I look at it, I remember what it cost us to understand what marriage really means. It isn't about choosing your spouse only when everyone approves. It's about choosing each other when someone doesn't. So let me ask you something. If you were sitting at that dinner table and your father publicly humiliated your husband while your husband laughed instead of defending you, would you have walked away? Or would you have stayed and tried to fix things right there? Tell me in the comments. Because sometimes the hardest decisions aren't about who is right. They're about deciding what kind of person you are willing to become when the people you love disappoint you.